Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samuel. Here with me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle. So, Peter, the Daily Telegraph today, Daily Telegraph is one of the most rabid Russophobic media outlets in the world today. Anyway, it has today a longish interview with historian Antony Beevor, who's written some interesting books about the war. He's written a number. He's also written about the Spanish Civil War. He's written a book about Operation Market Garden with R&M and everything. But now he's got a new book out about Rasputin and Nicholas. And
Hmm.
naturally, the Telegraph went to him to, hey, well, what's your take on the war in Ukraine? And as you might have expected, out came an extraordinarily vituperative, always, extraordinarily hostile, kind of almost hysterical in its hatred for all things Russian. And it's sort of very disappointing to say the least, but entirely to be expected, when it's given that the outlet that somebody with some historical knowledge should be
Yeah.
mouthing these kinds of cliches. So just to give you a sense of this interview, um, so here it is. And the headline, which gives you a sense of what we're dealing with. Antony Beevor: for Russia, conspicuous cruelty is a necessary weapon of war. So you got to know that's what you're going to get. And what happens here is precisely what we've always come to expect from a certain kind of historian or a certain kind of commentator on Russia. Well, the Russians don't care about human lives. They just
Yes.
absolutely don't care. They just don't care about it. They lose 1 million people, doesn't matter to them. They just have no respect for human life. I mean that's it's in the Russian DNA, and that's what you get from this interview. So he says the leading historian of conflict says the atrocities in Ukraine are rooted in a uniquely brutal mindset that can be traced back to centuries. So then you're going to get the usual stuff. Oh yeah, let's
Yeah.
go like to the Mongols.
He is a I would even say great historian. Um, Particularly his coverage of the Second World War, which he really went into the archives. And he found things that were unpleasant for many Russians. Okay. He found a lot of things were unpleasant for a lot of people. That's why I think he's a good historian. But this is such a cliche.
Right.
This is going back to the Napoleonic period of betraying the Russians, and it never has changed,
No,
ever.
no, no, that's right. Um, and of course, it's very interesting because it's like whenever it's the sort of mindless cliches that whenever Russia wins, well, they didn't really win. It was the winter. It was the Russian winter. And you always, whenever anyone says that, you always have to say, yeah, but the Russian winter is cold for everyone. I mean, it's like, yeah,
Yeah,
it's cold for Russians as it is for Germans.
they got lucky.
Yeah, that's right. And
No, luck has never ever played in any of the historical analysis.
right.
George is absolutely right. They have to find excuses why they won.
That's right. That's right. And in fact, when you a very good work of history, like in the Dominic Lieven, whose book on Napoleonic War, he said, well, no, it was nothing to do with winter. The Russians actually played a very, very shrewd game. It was the Russian strategy that was superior to the Napoleon strategy. That's why the Russians defeated Napoleon. It was nothing to do with the winter.
If Dominic uh, is a truly, truly great historian. Towards the Flame
Mm.
is one of the best, I think his best book. Okay. I mean, I've read it 3 times. I haven't read a book that many. It was 25 years ago, maybe I read a book a third time. Every time I read it, I learn more and more. It's a
Yeah.
brilliant book.
Right. So here is history can explain the present. It's terribly important on the question of Russia. and where the sheer brutality of the Russian army comes from, he says. Some will argue that it goes back to the 13th century and the Mongol invasions, but then one has to remember how appalling the 30 Years' War was in Europe. The difference being that we had the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment actually had an effect. And then in the 19th, in the 19th century, there was an attempt to, shall we say, civilize warfare with the creation of the Red Cross and attitudes like that. Um,
It's amazing. For someone of his stature, this is what you hear Europeans all the time. The real reason is that the Russians missed the Enlightenment. I've heard that
yeah, I know that's a
so many times.
But the interesting thing is that that civilizing war, the origin was Russia. That was where the first move were made in the 19th century, the civilizing war, which eventually led to the Hague Conventions, but it started in St. Petersburg. So even that, oh, well, we moved to civilizing war. Yeah, in Russia, that's where it was launched. Um, and all of those things, the Hague Convention, everything else, the Russians were a part of that. With the Russians, the attitude has always been that conspicuous cruelty is a necessary weapon of war, and we're seeing this in Ukraine. But then you say, well, what's the evidence for this? I mean,
I don't, yeah.
where's the evidence? And you say, how come civilian casualties have been so limited? I mean, look, you want to look at conspicuous cruelty. Look at what's been going on in Gaza. Civilian casualties as opposed to military casualties. Here,
And,
it's been almost all military casualties, very few civilian casualties.
and who's probably on going to the airport to go to France right now? Zelensky. After all this time,
Right,
its international airport is still functioning.
right.
Really? Okay.
Exactly, exactly. These words strike me to the bone. This is the journalist speaking. He's one of the worst among them. Russian atrocities are not incidental to the work of malign individuals or even units. They are inherent in how Russia fights and has always fought. This is a classic. It's in their DNA. Whenever they start this kind of speculating, oh no, it's actually in their DNA how they fight. It suddenly becomes clearer why Russian soldiers have pillaged and terrorized just about every Ukrainian town and village they've ever captured, murdering the men, raping the women, or kidnapping the children. Well, this is very interesting because where is this? What's the evidence? I mean, all those stories about raping and so on. None of that has ever been demonstrated.
Well,
So they're wheeling this out about how they're
yeah,
raping
I
women,
mean,
raping children. All of that is just a crock.
you and I have been covering this conflict, this part of the conflict on a daily basis. Even in Western media, we don't have reports of
No,
this.
exactly, exactly.
I mean, if it were happening, oh, these publications would run with it.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. The mass graves in the Kiev suburbs of Bucha and Irpin and the piteous list of the 19,500 missing Ukrainian children show what it really means to be invaded by Russia. But as Lavrov invariably points out, well, you keep bringing these numbers up, and whenever we ask for the names of these children, you come up with a few dozen. So where are these? If there are, you're saying 19,500, where are the names of these 19,500? Not just a sort of a few dozen names, the 19,500 children's names.
And I would also point out when the coup regime took power in February of 2014, they started a merciless shelling of the Donbass. Thousands and thousands of children were evacuated to Russia
Right,
for safety.
right,
So, what's our time frame here?
right,
Okay,
right,
because when the Donbass was being mercilessly shelled, not a peep from this publication.
right. No, 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 exactly. And they've never talked about this, like the Odessa fire in the trade union building, which the Russians talk about. It's never no one ever talks about it in the West. There were people who just burnt alive in that trade union building.
When it comes to Bucha, Russia has even brought this up at the United Nations Security Council
Right,
and asking for the investigate whoever is being
right,
investigated, please show their findings. They have not done that.
The findings and the identities of the people. I mean, you have all these bodies. Can you
Who are
provide us with
they?
names? Who were they? Putin's soldiers, adds Beevor, have often been brutalized by the appalling treatment they have suffered from their own comrades. While in Russia in the 1990s, researching his book on Stalingrad, he remembers learning how there were up to 5,000 suicides a year amongst the recruits called up for military service, and Russian generals thought that was funny. So
Yeah.
you kind of
Well,
wonder, yeah, go on.
Well, that was an existential war, and it does and it doesn't forgive anyone that brutalizes soldiers under their control. But
So
it,
hold on.
it
I guess I didn't quite understand. Is he talking about at the time of Stalingrad, the 5,000 suicides, or
yes,
is he talking
yes.
about the 1990s? So because he says while in
Oh,
Russia,
okay, okay.
I
This
because I somehow
it's
read that as being
okay.
the
Now
suicides in
that
the 1990s, but you may be
now that
right.
you mention it, I'm not sure what he's talking about.
Right. I'd be surprised that at the time of Stalingrad, people were committing suicide. Um,
No, because the Germans would do it for you. So
right, exactly. I mean, why would you commit
no,
suicide?
we shouldn't make light of this here. But everyone Russia has a volunteer force. People are signing up of their own volition. There's plenty of social media here. If there were suicides of this magnitude or the brutalization,
Right,
it
right,
would get back home. You can't hide this,
right,
okay? And
right,
the Russia's lost over 1 million men. That is impossible.
right.
Society would know about. Mothers and fathers would know about
Well,
this.
but you
Okay?
see, that's right. But you see, when I read this, I thought that there were 5,000 suicides a year during the 1990s. And he said, and Russian generals thought that was funny. And then I thought, yeah, but the problem with the suicides is that they weren't being fed. They had no, they had no income. That's what happens during the 1990s. Very high suicide rates throughout society during the 1990s. There was a huge drop in the population. I mean, that was a major demographic calamity during the 1990s, and suicide was, among the many causes of the deaths. So I thought that's what he was referring to.
He may well be, and most likely he did. I read it in a different way, but now
Right, but but you may be right. I mean, because it's a very confusing sentence, and that's why. Anyway,
remedial English again.
yes, yes. Russian conscripts then and now kill themselves because they are not merely bullied, but relentlessly persecuted and tortured by their fellow soldiers. And their generals frequently approve of what is, in effect, a hallowed tradition of tormenting newcomers. So you sort of wonder, what century are they talking about? Because of course this is powerful, of course, in many militaries. There have been books written about it, about the 19th century Prussian army, the 19th century British army. Bullying went on. So but they want to say, well, this is somehow uniquely Russian. But the crucial thing is what you just said, which is these are conscripts. The conscripts are not being sent to Ukraine. So they know they're not going to be sent to Ukraine.
That's right.
They serve elsewhere. It's only the volunteers who are sent to Ukraine.
Yes, yes. And there are billboards, not many. I mean, you have a lot of patriotic ones that are not necessarily, and very few of them actually make a direct reference to Ukraine. But there's a nice hefty sign-up bonus
Yes,
that is an enticement, and they fulfill the army, the military meet their quotas every single month without exception. Young men are joining. Okay,
right.
and I extrapolate from what people say. You know, even the most rabid people on social media here that are against the special military operation, none of them say this.
Right.
None of them.
That's right. Beevor heard from a diplomat about one Russian general who had a favorite dining out story describing how so many of his conscripts in Siberia were dying by suicide that he would make new arrivals dig rows of graves since they would surely need them before long. The general's punchline was, and do you know, half of them deserted.
Okay,
Um,
urban legends.
yeah,
That's
I think yeah, that's right. He heard from a diplomat. So this is
you
it.
know,
So you
a
didn't hear it
Western
from a general.
diplomat,
Yeah,
uh,
who's the diplomat?
An Estonian diplomat, a
Estonian
Finnish
or one of
diplomat.
these rabid British diplomats. I mean, that some of them are just completely off their heads. So yeah, he heard from a diplomat. I mean, that's about as as dubious a source as you can imagine. A diplomat. Um, and then Beevor continues, the brutality with which Russian soldiers are treated produces what can only be described as a knock-on theory of oppression. Because they've been oppressed and treated badly, they then take it out, as we saw in 1945 on Polish women. Now, Hungarian women and above all German women, and we're seeing it again with Ukrainian women and with Ukrainian prisoners. Well, now Beevor made a whole thing about this in his book, the Battle of Berlin, which was this mass rapes. I don't think it's ever been really established that there was indeed, these. I mean, there were rapes as there are in any
Any
war,
war.
but whether this mass rapes, this whole the idea that the Russians were actually going out of their way, they was going to be, over and above what any army has ever done. I don't think it's ever been established. I think that
Well,
as
from what
Beevor
I
did
understand.
this and people seized on this. Oh, Antony Beevor says this about the mass rapes.
From what I understand, it gets down to it's a question of methodology. He took a time period and a place and extrapolated it out through the entire city. And people that have questioned his claims here say that his methodology is very, very weak. George and I are not going to deny that rape is a weapon of war. It has been from time immemorial. But this is, again, a way to demon, they won the war. Yeah, maybe, but they raped a lot of women. That's
Right.
how I read this.
That's right. But it's a way of discrediting
Of course.
the Red Army. So, well, yeah, yes, the Red Army won, but look what happened as the Red Army was marching through Europe. They were going around raping women. But I think it's always very dubious because when you have these stories, what's the source of your stories? I mean, there's always going to be interested parties. And there were many countries where the Red Army was definitely not welcome. So there was always people had a vested interest in presenting the Red Army in the most negative possible light.
Yeah.
Um, and then he said, and we're seeing it again with the Ukrainian women, with Ukrainian prisoners of war. Well, where are these stories about raping Ukrainian women? I mean, he's
Well,
saying we're seeing it again
where
with
are the
Ukrainian women.
where are the Ukrainian prisoners that have returned? Held, was it there? Will they confirm this?
Exactly. That's right. Um, in Berlin, the downfall of 1945, Beevor described how Russian soldiers would gang rape not just German women, but the starving and emaciated survivors of
Oh,
concentration camps and slave labor factories.
yeah, an anorexic woman. Oh, yeah, that's real attractive. Okay, yeah, come on, come on.
Also, why would they do that? What's the incentive to? I
Well,
mean,
no, what was the camp? Was it Dachau? I'm trying to remember the camp. It was a camp that was liberated, I think, by the Americans. Yeah, the Russians that escaped the camp when the gates opened. Yeah, they went into town and they slaughtered everyone. Okay, yeah, that's what happens when you cage people up like that. Okay, they went after the police. They went after the military guys that have taken off their uniform. Yeah, they acted in a very savage way. Yeah, they do. That happens. Okay.
right now, but that happened in that happened in a number of places. I mean, like the Poles set up camps for Germans, and boy, did the atrocities they perpetrated against the Germans were really quite horrific. I mean, that just those Polish camps that was then set up in 1945. The Germans there were treated absolutely horrifically. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Those things happen.
Yeah, but see,
But the
what this
problem, but
historian
here
say,
I don't understand. They're saying the starving and emaciated survivors of concentration camps. You're saying Russian soldiers raped the survivors of concentration camps, and that doesn't even make any sense on any level. I mean, yes, emaciated, but what's the point? Why would you rape anyone who was supposedly on your side? I mean, I mean that's what I mean. It just doesn't make any sense. I mean, what you just said. Yes, Poles started raping and inflicting all kinds of tortures on the Germans. Yeah, yeah, I understand where that's coming from, but this I don't. There doesn't seem to be any logic there at all.
Again, only Russians do this. This is what
Yes.
they're telling us. Okay.
Um, The Red Army's soldiers were so out of control, they were even raping the Russian women and Jewish women and Ukrainian women and girls who had been sent back to Germany for slave
Yeah,
labor.
well, would you put this in your book with an asterisk or a footnote and tell us the source of
This
this
also,
information?
yeah,
Because this sounds like hearsay,
right.
and in a very, very nasty way. Well, this is how you destroy your reputation. Okay, this
Yes,
is
yes, yes. Um, Yes. It's interesting though his great preoccupation with rape. I mean, you're always going to wonder why somebody's that preoccupied with this, and that's why I'm always very dubious about these kinds of accounts of atrocities. Is whenever people start getting very, very preoccupied with the sexual thing of it. You kind of think something going on in the mind of the author is very preoccupied with with these sorts of rape. I mean, we had this particularly when we had the wars in the Balkans. The Serbs invariably there were the stories about rape. They were raping and setting up rape camps. We of course we had that also with Hamas. Oh, rape. There was mass rape that was taking place. And of course, that was as much a crock as the story of the Serb rape camps.
yeah. They don't like to really focus on what the Wehrmacht did in the
No,
Soviet Union, do
no,
they?
no, no. And then, does he believe the Russians think there is something legitimate about cruelty in warfare? Thanks for throwing that little question at this. They don't give a damn about legitimacy, to be perfectly honest, replies Beevor with a hint of incredulity. As far as they're concerned, their phrase is nobody judges a victor. And that is very much their attitude. For example, in Ukraine, the massacres in Bucha and elsewhere were horrific. So the point is that he's a historian and
Yeah.
he doesn't show any skepticism. He doesn't say, well, the alleged massacres or anything like that, yeah, let's hold off before we go. No, no, no. The massacres in Bucha and elsewhere were horrific. They may also have been propelled by anger and bitterness as they suddenly realized that they weren't winning and having a walkover as they expected. Um,
Well, and so okay, again, that's a very poor historical
it is. It's
reading.
a kind of,
I mean, maybe because the argument I would make, and it makes more sense, is that they moved on Kiev as these talks were going on in Istanbul as a reminder, we need to wrap this thing up or it will continue. Okay.
right.
And the British and the Americans said no, and then they withdrew.
Well, they shouldn't have done that. I think that was I mean, we talked about it before. I think that was a huge mistake. You don't withdraw until there's an agreement that has been signed. I mean, I think because once you
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
withdraw,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
I mean, in the way that it was always something like Bucha was always going to have they're
The
going to
thing
come up with a
is
story. Oh, well, look, we found these bodies. Look what the Russians did.
the fact of the matter is that Russians don't like killing Ukrainians. It's
Yeah,
just something they don't like.
right. Yeah. Um, Russia has probably suffered 1 million casualties so far, 250,000 dead, 750,000 wounded, according to CSIS. That was a very dubious story. I remember that when they came out, it didn't really have much of a source for that. But what I always find it funny is when they make this estimate, you say, okay, well, that's interesting. And what's your estimate of the Ukrainian casualties? Well, about 30,000 killed and probably 100,000 wounded. So that's the way you've estimated. So the Russians, it's about 6 or 7 times heavier casualties than the Ukrainians. So you know right away that this isn't serious statistical estimates. Um, And then, yet, despite this colossal human cost, Putin remains bent on conquest.
No, he doesn't. But
Bent on conquest. Trump is about to send envoys to Moscow, and he might yet join hands with Putin to impose a Russia-friendly settlement in Ukraine, rewarding aggression and risking another war. So that's the Telegraph. This is good reporting from the Telegraph. And then once again, Beevor, dwells on Russia's inhumanity towards its own forces. The High Command has placed crematoria in Ukraine to avoid the trouble of burying their own dead or repatriating corpses.
I have never heard that
I've
such a
never heard
thing.
that either, and the yeah, I don't understand why. Again, why would they do that? I mean, they obviously preserve the Ukrainian bodies. I mean, whenever they have these exchanges of bodies, the Russians come up with bodies of Ukrainians that they hand over and say, well, why don't so they preserve Ukrainian bodies, but they don't preserve the bodies of their own soldiers. Putin has replaced his losses partly by the simple device of emptying Russia's jails and forming convicts into punishment units to clear mines or launch suicidal attacks. This
That
tactic,
the only evidence of that I'm aware of convicts was with the Wagner Group, not in the general
but
population.
to be honest, I don't quite see anything terrible about that. I mean, they're convicts, okay, so that's you've got human labor there. They're facing what 25 years to life. You're given an option. You want to spend the rest of you want to spend 25 years or the rest of your life here in prison, or do you want to go fight? Um,
And maybe go free.
and exactly that's part of the deal, and then go free. So I don't see anything particularly immoral about this. I mean, these are people who are going to be in prison for the rest of their lives. Here, there's an option. You can fight, and then you'll go free.
Well, for everybody, from what I understand of the Russian penal system, that is a gift from God to be able. You mean you give me a gun and I can go into the field and you let me, and I'll never come back here again? Yeah, oh yeah, give me the gun. Let's
I
go.
think so. I think and said the tactic has echoes of the past. They've certainly been using the idea of punishment battalions that Stalin actually copied from the Germans. Okay, so they copied exactly. I
Yes,
mean,
and those that lived up to the bargain were freed.
right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, so what? So Stalin would. It's better to leave millions of people in those in the gulag, basically doing nothing. I mean, that's human potential, just simply whiling away the hours in the gulag, or you want to send them out in the field. I don't see that there's anything immoral about that.
I agree.
Beevor predicts that Putin will press on with tormenting Ukraine regardless of any peace agreement. He will certainly want to continue the war, even if there is some form of ceasefire or peace negotiation. He will break that and blame it on Ukraine and the Europeans, and once again count on Trump wanting to be proved a peacemaker. The strange thing about that is that you think, well, that isn't really the record of the diplomacy. I mean, it's the opposite of the diplomacy, which was Russia wanted to settle this. And it's the Ukrainians, and of course, the Ukrainians' Western partners basically they didn't do anything. I mean, all those years went on through the Minsk process, which wasn't going anywhere and deliberately wasn't going anywhere.
It's amazing how Russophobia can just chew up your brain. It's like a brain worm.
Right.
Okay. Because that entire paragraph is there, there's no basis in reality at all. There, as a matter of fact, it's very well documented, everything, just the opposite as the
Right.
case.
Like exactly. Um, yeah. I mean, if that was Putin's thinking, then why doesn't he take the ceasefire and then continue the war? I mean, he's basically saying,
Yeah.
no, we don't want a ceasefire.
Yeah,
We haven't achieved our objective.
why don't the Russians take an Israeli ceasefire? This is a ceasefire. Oh, there's violation, but it's still a ceasefire.
It's a ceasefire,
Okay?
exactly.
It's
Yeah,
still a ceasefire, okay?
that's right. Yeah, yeah. And Trump will agree with Putin that it's the fault of Ukraine somehow, even when the evidence points to a totally different direction. So I don't see the possibility of real peace. So this is what's so odd is that he's a historian, and yet he's taking such a one-sided view. And I think it's just it doesn't seem like the kind of thing that a historian should be doing. A historian is saying, yeah, both sides, there's arguments to say both sides, mustn't just take one side and takes entirely the Ukrainian side here. And then Beevor points to the ideologues on the fringes of Putin's court, notably
Here
Alexander
we go
Dugin.
again
Here we
with
go
this
with the
urban.
Dugin, yeah. A mystic and a nationalist, and Vladimir Medinsky, former culture minister, who believe in Russia's right to rule the entire Eurasian landmass from Vladivostok
Yes, not
to
ridiculous.
Dublin. Oh, all the way to Dublin.
Ridiculous. Oh God.
Dublin. I don't think it's even Dugin. I don't think Dugin thinks that. I mean, sort of Putin
No,
doesn't,
I mean, I
but I don't
think
think Dugin
no.
thinks that.
Dugin doesn't like Westerners, so why would you?
Exactly. I don't know why. I mean, it's very peculiar. Why would you want to rule over completely alien people? Non-Russian, non-Slavic people who don't want you ruling over them. I mean,
Oh,
it
that the
makes sense.
Soviets did that, and it didn't work out too well.
It
Yeah,
didn't, but even then, it was kind of limited. I mean,
limited.
yeah, yeah. No one can tell how far Putin agrees with them. But supposing he achieves what he considers to be a victory in Ukraine, will there be another target? I think that's distinctly likely, replies Beevor. I don't think it'll be Poland because the Poles have really rearmed and are effective. No, definitely his next move would be against the Baltic
Well,
states.
nobody in Russia wants the Baltic
I
states
don't
on
think he won the Baltic
TV.
states. Imagine having all these Kaya Kalasas,
No, let them stew in their own juices. Okay, that's
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Anyway, Bevo is instinctively wary of historical parallels. I haven't heard this
I
wariness.
haven't felt that myself.
Yet there is one that he will allow, and it should, I think, be carved in marble in every Western foreign ministry. The British and the French could not believe after the First World War that anybody would be stupid enough to want another war. That's why they underestimated Hitler and how far he was likely to go. We've seen a similar thing in the 2000s with Angela Merkel and a certain degree others. Nobody believed that anybody would want to have another ground war in the European landmass again. But we should have realized, says Beevor, that under Putin, sheer brutality of the Russian way of war could well be reapplied in the European landmass.
It's completely reversed. People like Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, they were calling, they thought that they could bluff the Russians into accepting a Western NATO expansion into Ukraine. They were bluffing, okay?
I,
And
I, I absolutely agree because if so the British and the French could not believe, okay, um, but then you say, why then? What was the logic after the Cold War of expanding NATO? I mean, if that's the thing, yeah, we saw this Cold War. We don't
what
want
do
we
we
don't want any more
want to
Cold
do it?
War and everything. Why did you then go ahead and move the Iron Curtain 1,000 miles eastward? And you didn't think Russia would respond if you just simply pick up the Iron Curtain and then just move it in 1,000 miles eastward, and then somehow it's the Russians' fault. Um, and then that's it. So that's the Antony Beevor.
What a disappointment. What a
It is a
disappointment.
disappointment because exactly you think, well, like he's a historian, bring a historian's perspective, which is what you would expect, a historian's perspective, and he's just a propagandist, just like a
Okay, well, here's a question
Telegraph
for you.
editorial writer.
Richard Sakwa, is he pro-Russia, anti-Russia, pro-Europe, anti-Europe?
You're absolutely right. Exactly.
You can't tell.
No, exactly. He's an
You can't
historian.
tell.
Yeah, that's right. You're absolutely right. He's a historian who's basically, yeah, he brings a historian's understanding to a crisis, and and he sees both sides. He presents both sides. That's what that's what you get from Sakwa. He's a propagandist. How is that any different from what you get from a Telegraph editorial writer? Oh, it's in the
I
Russians' DNA.
I guess it just sells, it'll help sell his book,
I
okay?
guess.
Because I have to question his intellectual honesty
Yeah,
here.
me too. Yeah. I mean, when you read that, you think, well, maybe, maybe. I mean,
You read that and say, I'll give the book a pass. Sorry.
exactly. I'll be a puzzle, and then you think, Well, there was always that question about the stories about the rape. He it featured quite prominently in his book about Berlin, about the Russians' rapes. And he was always very dubious, his sources. But when he starts talking like this, you think, yeah, I was right to be really dubious. I think everyone should be right to be so dubious about the way he just unquestioningly repeats the story about these mass rapes that the Russians were carrying out. And particularly, as I was saying, this is part of propaganda. It's a propaganda because it hits people on a very visceral level. So,
Yeah.
oh, they were carrying
Well,
out mass rapes.
October 7th, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I mean, so what, given his perspective, so the UK should declare war on Russia and get rid of this scourge forever? I mean, what is his, what does he propose?
Yeah.
What is he proposing?
That's yeah, that's a very good question.
It's always easy. It's so easy to offer up other people's lives,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But it's so very interesting how you demonize Russia. Russia kind of gets into this war, into World War One, really for the sake of the French. I don't know why they did it. I mean, it was a mistake to get into that war, but they did it for the sake of the French. Um, Nicholas, Nicholas, in order to save his life, he asked his cousin, George V, whether he could, the British would protect it. An ally. It was an ally. Britain and Russia were allies. And George V told his cousin, nah, we're not going to take you. That could have saved his life. The Romanov family lives could have been saved. The British said no, even though they knew that basically they'd be just massacred. This is after the revolution. So, when you just look at it, about, oh, the cruelty, there's a cruelty for you. But apparently, no, we don't have cruelty. It's the Russians.
Oh
They've got
yeah, I mean, look how Churchill talked about the famine in India and
yeah,
what was going on in Sudan and Ethiopia. I mean, he couldn't be bothered whatsoever. And
yeah,
cruelty was
no,
part and parcel of British foreign policy. Yeah, this goes back to what I find so frustrating and unproductive. We can all agree that immoral things happen in war. That's why we shouldn't fight these things,
right,
okay? But if you, if the war, if morality is the only prism in which you look at it, then you're misunderstanding how wars come about.
exactly. That's that's
And
that's
and
exactly right.
and and so it's just for me it's just so vacuous. Yeah, it's terrible, but it doesn't. I don't understand
No,
historically
I don't understand. And you
the
basically
problem.
still have to say that, 1941 through to 1944, they were carrying the entire war pretty much on their shoulders. They were taking all the hits. They were taking all the casualties. So you kind of have to have that, front and center before you start talking, oh, they're so cruel, they're so cruel. That's 3 years pretty much on
Oh,
their own. They were taking on the whole of the Wehrmacht.
oh,
And the staggering losses that they suffered as a result.
after the failed attack on Moscow in November, December of 1941, and then we have the victory in Stalingrad. Folks, they had 3 years plus of seeing what the Nazis had done to their people and
Right.
to their land, and I'm pretty sure they weren't happy about it, okay? And I'm not
I
justifying any war crime. I will never do that, okay? But given it was clear that this was a war of annihilation, okay? What does that do to your psyche?
right,
Okay? It's kill or be killed, okay?
right,
So the monstrous occupation of what the Nazis and their allies did to the Soviet Union you have no words for it.
right,
I
right.
mean,
No,
some films, some Soviet films, and early after the fall of the Soviet, and some Russian films, it's even difficult to watch how graphic you can present it. Okay,
yes.
so saying we fight moral wars, which is lunacy. Okay, wars have never.
Interestingly, Beevor kind of acknowledges, in some of his books, he kind of acknowledges For instance, the whole thing about prisoners of war. Remember there were Germans who were executed for because they executed prisoners of war. Well, that's a violation of the Geneva Convention. Boom, we've got him dead to rights. Beevor says the British and the Americans are doing exactly the same thing. They were also executing prisoners of war. This notion, oh, every German, we capture, we're now going to look after him, feed him, and everything. No, no, no. Prisoners, well, they were just shot. They just shot them, and that was that. And Beevor acknowledges this, that this is what they were doing. They were absolutely killing prisoners of war. But of course, at Nuremberg, it was only the Germans who were convicted for killing prisoners of war.
Yeah, yeah. This moralizing thing doesn't help us at all. As a matter of fact, it creates the seeds of more conflicts to come. No, that's not the way out. It's a way to sell books. That's all I can get out of this here. So disappointed, because I was an academic historian in a different iteration of my life, and if he were to present this as a paper, he'd be laughed out of the room.
Yeah.
All right.
All
All
right,
right.
so
All right. The previous video, we apologize. We just a internet gremlin got hold of us and wouldn't let go. Okay, so we apologize for that. It was already coming to an end, and this one's coming to an end as well. Um, we'll continue to watch bad history coming out of the West. Guarantee that. But in the meantime, we have a live stream tomorrow at
live
10
stream,
o'clock
exactly.
Eastern.
10 a.m. Eastern time. Please join us. Come with comments and questions. And always keep in mind this gentleman. He's very tough. He's very brutal. He doesn't give a quarter. Even the Russians would be afraid of him. He says money has to move into that tip jar. It's not doing any good just being, as the tip jar would say, I'm not a potted plant. So it's got to do things, that tip jar. It has to accumulate wealth. So if you have anything, everything in the tip jar, we're very grateful for all of your help, friendship, and support. The more you're able to donate, the more of these videos we can make, the more we can improve on the technology, and above all, might might just get a break from Buddy. It's going to be tough. Remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye bye.